Hello, Warfare in the Ancient World. Welcome back for another week's exciting content, wherein we're going to take the archaic Greek hoplite phalanx that we met in the last unit, and we're going to look at them in action against a foe who is fighting in a very different style with a very different sort of army model. That is the Medo Persian Empire, or just the Persian Empire. So this is a group that consolidated at about the same time that archaic Greek city-states were consolidating. And eventually, oh, I'm sorry, did you drop your binky? Pardon. And we're back. Yep. Now, in the middle of the 500s BCE, really early that is middle 500s BCE, a king named Cyrus began to expand from the Persian heartland that is in the southern part of what is now Iran. Bits of Iraq are encompassed in the Medo Persian homeland territory. And they began to expand into the Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, so ancient Mesopotamia, onward into the Levant, and then Egypt, and also Anatolia, which was astonishing for people living in the region because this is more territory now gained than had ever happened before in the region. And Greeks in the mainland weren't completely unaware of this. They were part of a connected world where people were sharing information with each other. Many Greek-speaking peoples in colony states in Anatolia and the Levant, and some also living in northern Egypt, came under Persian rule. So that's the context going into our next author, which is Herodotus of Halicarnassus. We're going to be reading his accounts of 3 different battles that happened during the Greco-Persian Wars, the Battle of Marathon, and then Thermopylae and Salamis. What, do you not like Herodotus?
No.
No, you don't like Herodotus?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I mean, well, yeah, he does have some harmful ideas and cultural biases, which are super problematic for using him as a source about the Persian Empire. You're absolutely right, James. Okay, as my TA has reminded me, we are about to go right into one of the biggest source biases problems underlying a period in ancient history. That is the anti-Persian bias of Herodotus, which has, with repetition and with film franchises and graphic novels, been a little bit more than a little bit overemphasized, especially in the context of America post 9/11 and the War on Terror. So we're going to roll this back a little bit. Before we get into Herodotus proper, I'm going to tell you my take on the Medo-Persian Empire, and I'm going to be a little bit of a fan, like full disclosure, as much as I'm ever a fan of imperialism and conquest, but there's a lot to love about the Persian Empire. They get a really bad rap these days, so I'm going to push back against this and kind of be a bit of a booster, because quite frankly, I think Xerxes could use the PR assist. He's pretty awesome, actually. What? No, we cannot read Goodnight Moon right now. Okay. Well, here, you can sit on my lap. All right. We'll read Goodnight Moon in a little bit. We need to talk about Cyrus. Okay. So, by the time of the Emperor Cyrus, the Persian people group and the Medians had intermarried and formed a combined dynasty, which is why sometimes you'll hear the Persian Empire called the Medo Persian Empire. As you'll notice, the Medes were the group with the largest territory, but the Persians were able to gain influence and combine them into this one whole. Uh-huh. No, we're not talking about dinosaurs. We're talking about Persians. Right. So with Cyrus, then, this consolidation of power turned into an expansion of borders through hostile takeovers, essentially. First beginning in the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which had itself become one of the largest imperial powers in the region before Cyrus rolls up. And the Neo-Babylonian Empire had accomplished this by systematically taking over smaller groups, and in some cases forcing them to be deported from their homeland and moved into the capital of Babylon. We know about this because one of the affected groups were the people of ancient Israel. So the Neo-Babylonian Empire caused their temple to be demolished, and large portions of the people moved into Babylon proper. If you're familiar with Jewish history, you'll sometimes hear this called the Babylonian Conquest. So it's an important moment in the history of that group in that region. So Cyrus rolls in, takes over Neo-Babylonia, and at that point, the Persian Empire kind of hits the world stage with a great deal of shock and awe that they continue to press to their advantage, eventually conquering everything you see colored in on the map here. So from Neo-Babylonia into Egypt and Anatolia, which brings them to the doorstep of Greece by the time we're at the 500-ish BCE mark. You may recognize this as the end of the Archaic, which is why we're here. Ah, yes, and as advertised, here's the Medo Persian Empire at its largest extent. So you can see the border stretching all the way to the Indus River Valley in Afghanistan in the east. And in the west, not only do they have all of Anatolia, but most of the Black Sea front too. And portions of northern Greece do eventually come under Persian rule, at least briefly. So, impressive, large. And if you happen to be a mainland Greek person, intimidating, because mainland Greece is the next logical jumping off point for this pattern of conquest. Having Greece would give you a foothold in the Western Mediterranean, a place to stage from, and it was also seen as an important area to have out of the way as a point of rebellion, which is yes, this isn't distracting at all. We'll read the little blue truck in a minute. Okay, I just finished telling you about the Medo Persian Empire, and then I have to read my son a book. All right, what are we doing? Yes. Mainland Greeks, as they watch this situation develop, eventually start to encourage Greek speakers living under Persian rule to revolt, which is what sparks off this entire conflict in the first place. Yeah, I think that's what I want to say about this. All right, pause for a minute. We got to read about the little blue truck. All right, so here we're looking now at an internal map of the Medo Persian Empire and the key to much of its success, namely a kind of proto-federalist system in which different states, as they are conquered, are turned into satrapies. So a satrapy is one of these states within the Persian Empire, and the person in charge of that state is a satrap. Now, that isn't the brilliant part, although it's pretty nice. Yes, Jim Jims. I know. We can't talk about the truck now. We're talking about Persians. Yeah, I know. These satraps were chosen from amongst the people who normally would have been ruling the region, were they not under Persian rule. The other thing that was a pretty good choice on the Persians' part was that other than tribute, and tribute could be delivered in goods, wealth, surplus, and also military staffing and equipment. So you'd send a certain number of soldiers from your satrapy with a certain amount of wealth to the king of Persia annually. And then if you were in distress, you could call on that combined military force to come to your aid and defend you. If you were having a food shortage, then the empire would be your safety net. And you wouldn't necessarily have to conform your laws to meet Persian laws beyond a certain point. James. So the person who normally would have been charged still would have been in charge. So if you like your local tyrant, you can keep them. You just call them a satrap now, which is what ends up happening in Herodotus's hometown, which is Halicarnassus in the satrapy of Caria. His satrapy was ruled during this period we're about to go into, the period of the Medo Persian Wars, by a satrap named Artemisia. Artemisia was the daughter of the former satrap. She was from a local Greek-speaking family and would have been a tyrant had she not been, well, the satrap. And she was one of the Persian king's closest advisors and followers. I mean, very well-trusted badass. We'll be talking more about her later because I kind of adore her. The point here to make is that when the Persians rolled up on you, you'd be offered a choice. Either you agree to be part of the Persian Empire, you send them a certain amount of tribute, you offer them the symbolic gifts of soil and water, and then the Persians, in their turn, wouldn't dismantle your government, they wouldn't make anybody move, they wouldn't mess with your cities, you wouldn't even have to mess with your local law. Everything remains the same. You just pay the Persians some protection money and then can count on the Persians for backup if things go haywire. Now, I am still describing imperialism. I'm going to make it clear, I still don't think it's okay to roll up into other people's countries and force them to do what you say. But in terms of tyrannicalness, the Persian Empire is one of the most mild historical examples of empire. Now, this isn't the way it always happens, because if you say no to Persia, yeah, exactly. Persia is not going to honor your consent very much. If you resist, then Persia plays hardball. Then you get invaded, and you are given a much less good deal because you resisted. And I'm, just to be clear, I'm not blaming people for resisting or saying no. Yeah, I know. Gosh darn it, you. I'm just saying that we're going to meet a lot of empires this semester. The fact that this is the one that Hollywood chooses to demonize is a little bit of a head scratcher to me. Not gonna lie here. Here we're looking at some relief sculptures from Persepolis. So this is one of the royal cities of the Persian Empire. This is in the heartland of what is now Iran. And we're looking at this because we're going to meet our kings for this coming conflict. Darius, or Darius, you can say it either way, it's fine, and his son Xerxes. So Darius is the king during the Greco-Persian Wars 1 and 2. I'll talk about my numbering system later. Persian War 3 is Xerxes the son. Here they are, chilling out, meeting people in their throne room, and although they're shown larger than everybody else in the scene, as Near Eastern kingship tropes go, this isn't the most overbearing on the Ramses II scale of megalomania. This doesn't even register quite. Another thing I'm just going to point out, nobody is wearing a glittery gold bikini or multiple face piercings. They all have a lot of hair. Nobody's bald. And don't go out and see 300 if you haven't, because, but I'm just putting this out here. Super problematic movie, guys. Super problematic for this and other reasons. Now, this is not to say that Persian kingship wasn't an institution with a divine component to its claim to power. The title they had for themselves was the King of Kings. That is the king who controls other kings, which is essentially a description of a satrapy. Yeah? These are kings who are controlled by the great king in Persia. But they also believed that they had a quasi-divine role too. And the state religion was heavily bound up with the mechanics of legitimizing the role of the Persian king. So there is a god-king component here, but nothing out of the realm of normalcy for the ancient world. The thing that was unusual here was just the scope and size of the territory encompassed by this system of government. Now, coming up in this bit of art, and this is on a monumental staircase going into the palace, so this, much like Ramses' art, is propaganda, and it is serving a specific function, so we need to still read it as such. But in this scene, there aren't people being held by the hair, nobody's being slaughtered, rather there's a line of people coming from all over the empire, coming up to the kings and taking on this pose, this kind of, let me do this way, hand-to-mouth pose that our audience seekers showing us here is a gesture that you would do to a god, yes, but he's making eye contact. It's a gesture of obedience, but also nobody's like on their face on the floor. There's a kind of envisioning of membership in the Persian Empire as not being equivalent to slavery, although ancient Greeks certainly do push for that interpretation of this. They're standing up of their own free will. Nobody's forcing them to give the king stuff. The kings themselves don't have that much in the way of a bodyguard between them and their subject. You can see a couple of guards here at the back, but the subject is approaching and offering things in a show of consent. I mean, it's not quite consensual because it's, you know, a system that involves threats of violence to function. But part of what the Persians want you to see when you see them is not imminent threat of death and suffering, but rather they want to give this illusion of consent, and that's important in getting a feel for the vibe inside the Persian Empire. Also pictured, this is from another part of the same site, we have these guards who we think might be the immortals that Herodotus discusses. Again, this is something that 300 the movie takes and runs with in a really bizarre direction. These are just the elite Persian bodyguards. They're here all dressed in very expensive clothing. To weave this kind of fabric with these sorts of motifs requires a lot of skill. There's a lot of fabric in this clothing, but the clothing is essentially the same cut and amount of fabric as you can see worn by the kings here, Xerxes and Darius versus their elite bodyguard, and that's not a coincidence. These are other members of the Persian elite, and you'll also notice, you can see it a little bit better here, they're wearing what may be pants, may not be, but in other art, trousers are a feature of Persian clothing that we see both in Greek art and in Persian art, so it's probably trousers, but not definitely. This is because they're a horse riding culture. So the Persian success initially and their ability to put pressure on the Medes and then become a part of a combined ruling class is through their expertise in cavalry and mounted archery. So that's part of their thing. However, on the walls of the palace, they aren't going to war. They're off their horses, they have their bows, but they're over their shoulder. They're at their ease, and while force is a potential, it's not being imminently displayed. Again, kind of think back to Ramses II and the lack of subtlety involved in his self-presentation, and this is trying at least to be a bit of a kinder, welcoming sort of imperial face. I've also included a sphinx. This is something that we see in Near Eastern art that we also see in Greek art. Interestingly, there's a gender shift. Greek sphinxes are I'm going to say almost all because I haven't seen all sphinxes, but I've never seen one that wasn't, that didn't have female sexual characteristics. So like breasts, what appears to be a lady face, gendered hairdos that women in Greece have. Whereas here in Persian art, as is the case in Babylonian art, you have a male face on the Sphinx body. So interesting. Sometimes you'll also see them on a lion body, I think is a lamassu. At any rate, this is the object that those relief sculptures come from. So the bit with Darius and Xerxes is here on the front of the staircase, and then coming up both sides is a long line of people from every corner of the empire. Here we have the Immortal Guards again, probably that's who that is. All of them coming peacefully and of their own free will to offer up their gifts to King Darius and his son Xerxes. So here's a sample of these relief sculptures, just to give you an idea of who's all there and showing up. In this particular one, we see people from the Indus River Valley. This is people from India here. At the top, I think there's some Bactrians. There's some people from the steppe lands north of the Black Sea. So this is ancient Scythia. This is the same place where the Proto-Indo-European heartland is from. There are multiple nomadic peoples living in this area who are not technically under Persian control, but are Persian allies in this next conflict. They also sometimes show up as allies in the Greek city-states too. At one point, Athens is hiring them for security. I think we're going to have to read the Blue Truck book again. Yeah, wish me luck. Okay, we've said goodnight to the moon. Now back to the Persian Empire. This is a map of the empire with the peoples from this relief we were just looking at superimposed to give you an idea of the range and the representation on the staircase. So the idea of putting this in your palace is to emphasize that you are a diverse nation with many peoples, all of whom are treated equally by the kings, welcomed into the presence of the king together, and all of them paying their taxes. This is what the Persian Empire wanted you to think they were all about. They're about inclusion, diversity, a united front. Now, the reality, like most imperial powers, is a lot more complicated. But this is something that I don't think gets talked about enough when we're talking about the Persian Empire. They are just Persians, and this is an environment that celebrates and advances diversity and interchange of ideas and goods in a very diversity positive environment, which is not what we see in the Greek mainlands, just to make this super duper clear. Greek city-states were very much about restricting citizenship to people who were from that area. In Athens, this gets increasingly tighter and tighter to where all of your grandparents have to have been born in Athens. And they begin making arguments that Athenians had sprung from the earth itself. Therefore, if you weren't related by blood to enough Athenians, then you weren't pure and you couldn't be considered an Athenian citizen, which I hope we would all agree is not an ideal way to think about diversity. And Sparta, it's even worse. Like, they have a local class of hereditary enslaved people whom they have an annual ritual where they get their upper class boys to go out and murder one, which is super messed up. Yeah. And that's essentially how citizenship works in Greek city-states. There's a lot of exclusion and restriction, and these are states where you have a lot of immigrant populations. I mean, Athens had a huge immigrant population, so many of the people living in Athens didn't have voting rights, didn't have the same amount of legal protection. They were living in Athens for the same reasons immigrants live anywhere where they're not a citizen, but it wasn't a place that had the kind of protections and inclusivity that you would have had in the Persian Empire. In the Persian Empire, if you paid your tribute, you were a full member of the Persian Empire. And this is the kind of world that Herodotus is working within. So when he's writing his histories, and they are pro-Greek histories, although they're not as anti-Persian as you might think, our interpretation of Herodotus has gotten more anti-Persian with time. Herodotus himself is certainly not dehumanizing towards the Persians. He gives them points for a lot of things that he admires. He's not necessarily their biggest fan, but he doesn't hate them and think they're inhuman either. He also calls Greek city-states out on a lot of their PS too. Herodotus, however, is pro-independent Greekness. We'll unpack that a bit later. And in order to make this argument, he downplays a lot of the benefits of membership in the Persian Empire. But this is a real dynamic that the Greek city-states have to deal with, is that as Persia is invading the Greek mainland, a lot of Greeks look at the deal that would come from saying, you can have your earth, you can have your water, great, we'll join the empire, don't kill us, and saying, well, that's actually a good deal, we should go with that. So Athens and Sparta are hard-pressed to keep a coalition together to defend against the Persian invasion. And it's going to be a huge command problem that we're going to see the folks at Marathon dealing with, and later Thermopylae and Salamis. So that's one dynamic that's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. So just keep this in your mind when you're looking at the reading, knowing that the commanders are constantly having to worry about their men just giving up and joining the Persians. How do they deal with that reality, and how are their command decisions driven by a need to keep their support from crumbling out from below them? Because that's a relatable command problem. A lot of theaters. Okay. Before we do that, though, I'd like to show you this artifact. This is the Cyrus cylinder. It dates to 539 BCE. It's in a cylinder. This is an early form of photocopying, printing, essentially. So on this cylinder are incised cuneiform words, cuneiform because this followed the invasion of Babylon by the Persians. And the cuneiform spell out the terms of Cyrus's victory and what he did to the Babylonians. This exists because multiple copies needed to be sent out, so everybody knew what happened if you told Persia no thank you, which is indeed what Babylon did. Persia comes up, they're like, hey, y'all, want to join Persia? And they're like, nah, dog, not going to do it. And then Persia's like, well, we're invading. And then they invaded. Babylon was like, haha, you can't invade us. Our city is impregnable. And Cyrus diverts the river, thus lowering the level of the river and exposing the water gates on either side of the city of Babylon. They come in through the sewers and boom, they take Babylon. Game over. It's a classic. I hope that's useful to you should you ever need to take a city with water gates. Or maybe not. Right. So Persia wins this one. Cyrus is victorious. And so to make an example out of the conquered Babylonians, he undoes a lot of what the Babylonian Empire did in their expansionistic phase. People who had been displaced from their homelands were given the support to go back home and to rebuild the lands that they had been evicted from, which is how the Second Temple in Jerusalem eventually gets built, is the Persians protect and sponsor Jews who wanted to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, and then gave them funding and support to help rebuild that temple, which is something you should keep in mind. The Persians were really big into religious plurality and religious freedom, and not all empires are cool with that. The Babylonians certainly were not fans of supporting Judaism and Jewish people's right to engage in monotheism. A lot of other empires we're going to look at also have problems with monotheism. Medo Persians, not so much. So one of the points of this is reversal of displaced population. So people get sent back home. There's a protection for freedom of religion within the ex-Babylonian territory. And also, and this one we have to be a little cautious about, because some modern interpreters get a little bit too rosy about this. But it is, I think, a good thing that I'm willing to give Cyrus kudos for. He frees all the people that had been enslaved by the Babylonians and also allows them to return home. Now, this doesn't mean that there was general abolition in the Persian Empire. This was meant to be a punitive measure. Because the Babylonians had defied Cyrus, one of the things he does to punish the Babylonian ruling class is to say, right, no more enslaved labor for you. So this isn't necessarily about human rights as such. This is meant to be an economic blow, but it's one of the first, if not the first, systematic abolition of slavery within a territory, like a blanket emancipation moment. And that's really significant in terms of the history of human rights, because blanket bans against slavery are going to start popping up again until we get into the 1800s, I think. My history after 400 CE is a little hazy, so if I'm missing something, let me know, but it's an important moment, and one that doesn't happen a lot in the ancient world. The ancient world is much more about enslaving people than letting them go. So I'm not going to say that Cyrus the Great is a complete abolitionist in the sense that I use for somebody who was an abolitionist. But he does, in this one case, in this one circumstance, engage in systematic abolition with a bit of a reparations plan too. So yay, Cyrus. And Cyrus doesn't just get respect in Persia for this. Herodotus praises him for this. Some mainland Greek people also seem to be fans. Depending on how you read Xenophon, we're not going to read a lot of Xenophon for this class, but if you're familiar with him, this is the author of the Anabasis. He also has some nice things to say about Cyrus. So Cyrus, even in places where people hated the Persian Empire, had a really good reputation. His name was solid. At any rate, this cylinder used to print off copies, you'd roll it across the clay and it would make an imprint, and then you could just send as many copies of this decree as you needed to. Just awesome in the history of printing, yeah. We still have it, and it's one of our earliest documents with early statements of human rights. It's not like a Bill of Rights in the classic sense, but it's a really important moment in the history of liberation, and go him. Right. So Persia takes over Babylon. Other countries soon follow, including Ionian Greeks. So last unit we talked about Greek colonists who were sent out, really some in the Dark Ages, but most during the Archaic period, whenever there was surplus population, or people sometimes themselves would move off to areas where there was more economic opportunity than mainland Greece, which is a lot of places in the ancient world and the Archaic. Let's be frank about this. This includes people along the westernmost coast of Anatolia. So this is the modern-day coastal line of Turkey projecting into the Aegean Sea. That is the area of the Mediterranean between Greece and modern-day Turkey, just coming out of the Black Sea there. Here's what they look like on that monumental staircase from Persepolis. They're carrying their tribute, which the little round things in their hands, those are beehives. So they're carrying honey, and the fellow in the front is also carrying folds of fabric. Next to them, not on the staircase, but I've put them on the slide here, are the non-Greek inhabitants of Anatolia, because keep in mind, Greek-speaking inhabitants are a minority in these little Greek-speaking colony enclaves surrounded by local folks, which in this case were the Lydians. So the Lydians are one of several ethnic groups living in central Anatolia, who then expanded and took up the territory in which these Greek-speaking colony states were settled. And that was the dominant power in the region, the kingdom of Lydia, until the Persians roll up and Cyrus takes over. It's an important moment in Herodotus. If you have extra time, read Herodotus book 1. And it's a fantastic story that we don't have time for here. My point here is that both Ionians and Lydians as separate ethno-cultural groups show up on the staircase, which indicates that with their propaganda, the Persians are being careful about their optics of inclusion, right? They realize that Ionian Greeks are not the same as Lydians, and they're representing them separately, all engaged in this process of okaying Persia together, which, as imperialist moves go, is not the worst. Yeah, so about this Lydian conquest, if you're wondering where Lydia is, here it is. This is after Lydia's expansion. So this orange area in our map here at the top has Lydia in the center, and then all along the coastline there's Troy, just for your reference, but Smyrna, Ephesus, Miletus, these are three of very many Greek-speaking colony states on this coast. Those are Ionian cities. Sardis, inland a bit, is the capital of Lydia. And let me step back a little bit. I said Persia invaded. That's not quite everything. Actually, Lydia starts this conflict. At least according to Herodotus, the king of Lydia goes to all the oracles, figures out which oracle is the best oracle. Surprise, it's Delphi in Greece. And then he asks, yeah, so like, what'll happen if I invade Persia? And then the oracle says, oh, if you invade Persia, a great empire will fall, which the king thinks, spiffy, that means Persia will fall. However, like most oracles, if you don't read the fine print, you're going to end up making bad life choices, which indeed this is. A great empire falls all right, but it's Lydia, not Cyrus. But again, according to Herodotus, even as the king of Lydia is being burnt alive, as his city is being taken over, Cyrus stops the burning alive process, rescues the former king of Lydia, and then keeps him around on his cabinet staff, essentially. This is a repeat pattern with the Persians, is they would keep people around who used to be their enemies, make them into allies, and then listen to their advice. That's part of how the Persians are so darn good at making an empire, is that they do listen to the people that they encounter and take their advice seriously. And you'll see this happening in Herodotus again and again, is that at critical moments, Xerxes will stop. He'll talk to his counselors, and his counselors will tell him stuff. And then he'll take it in and make his decisions subsequent to that. Some of them good, some of them a little sketchy. This includes, by the way, at the Battle of Thermopylae, he takes one of the kings of Sparta who had been kicked out of Sparta, he offers him asylum and then puts him in his cabinet. So he has a local advisor who's saying, oh yeah, this is why the Spartans are doing this, and da-da-da-da. Which is a great strategic advantage and a pretty good idea. So should you ever find yourself in the position of God King of your international empire, I strongly suggest that you make friends out of your former enemies and put them on your staff so that you can take good advice from them, instead of like turning them into an oppressed underclass without any input in your government. That tends not to end very well, guys. Okay, but why we care about this, well, many reasons, but this is the big one for this class, is the invention of the concept of Greeks. Now, this may seem like a bit of a moment, because we've been talking about Greeks for quite a while in this class. Yes, Jim. But more as a linguistic group than as any kind of coherent, unified people group. Hi. Uh-oh. The caterpillar is hungry. Please hold. All right, where were we? Yes. No, we're talking about... Sorry. So, with this invasion, however, and in the years leading up to it, we see a shift between the colony states of Ionia and mainland Greece, wherein mainland Greek emissaries begin going to these colony states and making the argument that because they speak the same language and worship the same gods and have similar customs, that they are more alike than are the Greek colony states of Ionia and their neighbors, the Lydians. So, by this logic, because these are people who speak your language, you should side with them, not with the people you live next to. And in order to make this argument work, they came up with a name for people who speak this language. That name is Hellenes. Hellas is the name they come up with for mainland Greece. So Hellas as the homeland for the Hellenes. This is named after a mythological person. I'm not going to go into that. It's not necessary. Just knowing Hellenes is the word that comes out of this. You need an opposite, though. So this is classic in-group, out-group identity formation. So if we who speak the Hellenic tongue are Hellenes, then people who are not us, the polite word for them are Medes, like from the Medo Persian Empire, right? So sometimes you'll see translations referring to the Persians as the Medes. Interchangeably, they're both referring to the same people. And with this label of Medes comes the term Medizing. So to Medize is if you, even though you speak Greek and worship Greek gods, choose to side with the Persians instead of with mainland Greeks, you have Medized, and you have somehow compromised your Greekness. Although you're still a Hellene, you're just a Hellene who's chosen slavery. Of course, they're not talking about literal slavery. This is an old tactic where we equate things that are not slavery to slavery. Things like paying taxes. It's not the same, but it's a kind of hyperbole that's used as a rhetorical trick to make one kind of oppression sound like a worse kind of oppression. At any rate, in this period, though, we get another term, and this is a term for people who don't speak Greek. And this term is barbaros, or barbarian. And this comes from a Greek stereotype that anybody who isn't speaking Greek, their language sounds like they're going bar, 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 bar. It's a parody of what Greeks thought Persian sounded like. And therefore, a barbarian is somebody who doesn't know how to talk right because they don't know how to speak Greek, and Greek is right. They're like, you see where this is going. It's a pretty standard ethnocentrism strategy here. One that still gets used a lot. It's the oldest one in the book, and it's a classic because it unfortunately works. But this is also why the term barbarian is so problematic. It was a term that developed in order to create an us versus them split within the Persian Empire by people in mainland Greece who were trying to create a counterpower network to Persian expansion. And it was also used to other, that is, to make people who aren't Hellenes seem more alien than they actually are. It's a movement to dehumanize by making fun of their language and their culture, and doing that in order to make Hellenes feel superior about their own culture. This was necessary, mind you, because in the Archaic period, people who spoke Greek had been interacting with people who didn't speak Greek for generations, quite productively. And even in Herodotus, which is one of the early authors to go really hard for this us versus them, Hellenes versus barbarian model to the world, even Herodotus admitted that a lot of the people he includes in the barbarian label are people whose cultures are older, more established, better provided with stuff. Herodotus says that the Egyptians are the oldest culture in the world and have the oldest language. So it's a rhetoric of superiority that doesn't base itself on saying that Greece is the oldest culture or the most developed or the fanciest, but rather, so Herodotus's argument goes, and this seems to be a general argument for the pro-Hellene factions in the Greek-speaking world, was that even though it's not the oldest and not the fanciest culture, because they have to live in rugged conditions and don't have the best farmland and have all of these mountains, and they're forced to be not united, although that's funny because they keep trying to invade each other every other week. So, but at any rate, because Greeks are so independent that they stick to the city-state model rather than forming into one large Greek empire. Therefore, they are superior because they have to fight for everything they have. I mean, it's still kind of a bogus way of looking at cultural superiority. It's just another model other than we are oldest. This we are scrappiest is a favorite tactic. So what you need to know about this process is that within the context of this conflict we're about to discuss, the Persians' war with the Greeks, from this moment comes the idea that Greeks are a thing. That even though they don't have political unity, they have a shared cultural unity and a shared ethnic identity. An ethnic identity that is bigger than just your citizenship in a city-state, and one that's meant to motivate people to side with other Greeks against barbarians. Just to be clear, barbarians is not something that anybody calls themselves as a label, right? Any argument that starts with the barbarians believe that, no. Exactly. No. It is very silly to call people barbarians. It's not an actual category, and it's super proto-racist, so don't do that. All right, next slide. Now, I said that this Hellene construct depended heavily on a shared language, but by shared language, I don't mean that Greek sounded the same everywhere in the Greek-speaking world, because it didn't. Here we're looking at a dialect map of different kinds of Greek, and these dialects are quite different. When you take ancient Greek at UMBC, you learn Attic Greek, or the Greek in pink here, the Greek spoken in Athens. And when you go to read the Greek spoken in, say, the Orange area, the Peloponnese, things are spelled differently, some of the grammar is different, the accents are a little different. Like, it is different enough that you have to learn it systematically to be able to read it. Now, you'll also notice that the Greek spoken in Ionia, Ionic Greek, is common to the Aegean Sea seafront, but isn't a really dominant way of speaking Greek in the Greek mainland. However, Ionic Greek becomes the Greek dialect in which scientific writing is written, due in part to the fact that scientific ideas sprung up in Ionia, not mainland Greece. This is relevant to me because I'm a medical historian. So although I learned Athens Greek, Attic Greek, when I learned ancient Greek in school, right now in my professional life, I spend most of my time reading Ionic Greek, where things are spelled differently and the grammar works differently. Which is all to say that Greekness isn't as unified as advocates of a Hellene world would have you believe, but part of the genius of the marketing of this Hellene concept is one of the things they put into the mix is the idea that being a Hellene means that you're not uniform. In other words, you share an amount of cultural stuff, but at a local level, you're also very different. So in other words, part of your Greek identity is this idea that your city-state is the only state, and if you have to take orders from somebody who isn't your city-state, then you're not fully Hellene. And this is important in Ionia, where if you live in Ionia, you are working for the Persian king, not for just your city-state. You've got a satrap, you're part of a Persian satrapy, and you're still paying taxes to Persia. So part of the persuasion going on here in the invention of the Hellene category and pushing it abroad is the idea that if you side with Hellenicity, then you have our help in breaking away from Persian control, and then we ourselves won't take it over. You can continue to be independent because independence is what Hellenes are all about. This doesn't last long. We're going to go to the Peloponnesian War next, so yeah, wait for it. Now, within this Hellenistic world, we need to talk a little bit more about Ionian states. Now, I mentioned that Herodotus is from an area called Caria. Caria is one of a Doric dialect speaking bit here on the southern end of Ionia. And the satrap, as I mentioned before, of Halicarnassus, Herodotus' hometown during this conflict, is the satrap Artemisia. Really nifty lady, Artemisia. She was a naval tactician, a very successful one, and it was under her leadership that her satrapy expanded to include the island of Kos. You may be familiar with Kos's most famous inhabitant, Hippocrates, like the medicine guy Hippocrates, that Hippocrates, yeah, he was from Kos, which is one of several islands that was conquered by Artemisia's fleet. Artemisia's fleet is an important part of Xerxes' invasion force during the Third Persian War, and that's important to emphasize. On the Persian side of all of these conflicts, there are a lot of Greek-speaking people. Most of the Navy, or not most, but at least a huge chunk of the Navy is piloted by Greek speakers. It's the same kind of ships that's being used across the Aegean. So making this war about Greeks versus Persians is missing something. This is also a war of Persian Greeks, or as Hellenes would call them, Medizers, versus Hellenes, inhabitants of city-states that are not under Persian control. And Artemisia highlights this. We don't have a portrait of her proper, but this is from one of the coins that was minted during her rule. This is showing the Greek goddess Nike, or Nike, like the shoe company's named after her. You can tell who she is because she's got wings on her back. Nike, the goddess of victory, flies from one group to another group. Here one day, gone the next day, much like victory. In her hand, she has the victor's crown, this leafy laurel wreath that you get both as an athletic victor or a military victor. And in her other hand, a ritual wand of caduceus that's a symbol of going to the afterlife. So she carries death in one hand and victory in the other, and wings on her back. Now the wings on her back look a lot like the wings we saw on the Sphinx. It's some Near Eastern imagery combined with Greek religious imagery. The winged goddess of victory, that's a very Greek thing. And that tells you what it was to be an Ionian in Caria. You're a little bit Persian and a little bit Carian and a little bit Greek, and all of it coexisting during this period pretty happily. Well, more or less, depending on who you are in this culture, but I'm going to close out this lecture with a slight rant, so like you can go do something else if you're not interested, James, in my hot take. I'm 302, Rise of an Empire, but if you are, you can stick around and hear my outrage. Outrage, I say. Because they somehow managed to fail one of the easiest tests to pass. That is the "Are you more sexist than an ancient Greek dude?" test. Our source author, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, gives us an Artemisia of Caria who is strategically brilliant, a member of Xerxes' inner council, listened to with great respect. Her ideas are better than other people's on the council, and she manages to survive the Battle of Salamis and keep her position in Xerxes' administration. She is competent, she is clever, she is flexible, and she is one of the most compelling characters in the work. Compared to this dang movie, in which somehow they think, okay, a competent lady commander is totally unbelievable in the ancient world, so I know what we'll do. Let's give her a rape backstory and make her a complete raving lunatic who beheads her own people and then Frenches them on board ship, and then somehow, for reasons, like, gets Themistocles onto her ship for a stupid sex scene. Really stupid. I'm sorry. I know I'm not sorry. I find this movie so deeply offensive. And would, even if I weren't an Artemisia of Caria fangirl. I really love this lady. But seriously, guys, and this is just my final plea. Those of you who have a hand in making media and art, I challenge you to rise above this bar. Don't be more sexist than an ancient Greek dude. Yes, bye-bye, Jimmy. Goodbye. No, come here. Help Mommy rant. Oh, please help Mommy record this lecture. You're so unhelpful. All right. But, yeah, it's just an utter miscarriage of ancient world writing, and also just such bullshit. Like, okay, you don't have to work to make the ancient Mediterranean world kind of sexist. Like, really, the facts themselves are bad enough. You do not have to make it worse. If you do, it makes you look super sexist. So, like, don't be that person. But also, Jimmy, Artemisia of Caria shows that in the Persian Empire, and she's not the only case of this, the situation for women is much better, not even a little bit better, much better than it is in, say, Athens, or even, Sparta gets a lot of press for being egalitarian because it lets women do sports. Guys, if your 7-year-old son is taken away from you and forced to be tortured in military barracks, that's not liberation. That's not egalitarianism. That's a totalitarian hellhole. But enough about Sparta. My point being, a pattern that we see in Ionia is that sexist tendencies that we see in the Greek mainland aren't present. We see a lot more representation of women in positions of leadership and authority, and this continues right on through the Persian period into the Roman period. And it transfers over even when these areas are ruled by Greek speakers after Alexander invades and takes over Ionia. These are areas where royal women continue to have a lot of power and influence, right down to the most famous one that you have almost certainly heard about, Cleopatra VII of Egypt, who stayed in power for 40, well, not for, she was 40, she stayed in power for decades, even as Rome was super desperate to take over her real estate, which is freaking amazing, guys. And she did it with the respect of the international community in the Eastern Mediterranean. The point being that there are all kinds of legitimate reasons to raise your eyebrow at the Persian Empire, starting with the, I think, I'm not going to say fact because I don't want to force you to believe what I believe, but I do think that empire is at the very least a complicated proposition that isn't great for everybody. And it's also something that happens at the expense of local sovereignty often, and with a cost paid over time in taxes being bled off towards the center, and also uneven leadership in the case of families that don't have a smooth succession, which is pretty much every royal family ever. That is to say, I don't think imperialism is the solution to all of our problems and the ultimate best form a state can take. However, if you're going to get mad at an empire in the ancient world for being really oppressive and violent and wasteful and destructive, Persia is a really weird choice to make. Persia's not as bad as it gets. In fact, if I had to pick, if you held me at sword point and made me choose my area of residence in the ancient world, I would go for Xerxes' Persia. There is a lot to love about it. And if I have to live in an empire, I would much rather live in that one than certainly a Macedonian kingdom, because, Lord, the toxicity. And, guys, I love Romans. I really do. If you've had me for Latin, you know this about me. But I think my life would have more freedoms and more options as a woman who hopefully owns property and isn't enslaved, I hope. Although chances are I'd probably be enslaved, because demographically speaking, the enslaved population is quite large in the ancient Mediterranean. But Rome wouldn't be it. Just, yeah, definitely not Athens. God, not Athens. Athens over Sparta, though. I don't want to be forced to exercise and to have eugenics babies for the state. That is effed up, guys. It's really effed up. Like, I don't want someone killing my baby because they're not meeting a standard of physical perfection. That's ableist and really wrong, and also a horrible way to live your life. That isn't women's liberation. Okay, so my final point is that empires are objectionable, yes, but the Persian Empire gets an unfair shake for reasons that are pretty racist, super unfair, and we should push back on against a bit. So we'll move into the actual conflict next lecture, but I hope this was enjoyable and my rants were fun and little man wasn't too distracting. I will see you in the next episode when we discuss Herodotus of Halicarnassus and the actual Persian invasions. Ciao.